This episode's brought to you by our Patreon members. Join our growing community for early access to every episode, exclusive video versions of the podcast, behind-the-scenes footage, full-length product demos, and more. We appreciate you. Welcome back to Martins and More. My name's Maury Rutch with another special edition episode. This week, Spoon is in the middle of remodeling his studio, so it'll be another week before we can actually connect on a traditional podcast recording. However, we do have another field trip for you. This time, it's the Martin Guitar Museum. I took a ride to visit our friend Jason Ahner, and he walked us through all the beautiful rich history, all the beautiful instruments. It's going to be a beautiful episode. Sit back and relax as we enjoy a virtual tour through the Martin Guitar Museum.
Hi everyone, this is Jason Ahner. I manage the archives and museum here at Martin Guitar, and we're joined today by Maury and the Martins and More podcast. So I'm going to walk you through some of the history of Martin Guitar, and we're going to take a look at some of the really iconic instruments we have in our collection. But first, if you want to come visit our museum, we have around 180 instruments on display. It's open 8:30 to 4:30 Monday through Friday, and while you're here, you might as well take a tour and see how the best acoustic guitars in the world are made.
Nice.
So first, we're going to start at the beginning. C.F. Martin Sr. was born in Markneukirchen, Germany in 1796. His father was a cabinet maker by trade, but he was also building violin cases because Markneukirchen, they were a major hub for violin building. And another fact about C.F. Martin Sr.'s father was he was one of the first guitar builders in Germany at that time. And he saw as his son was getting older, he had more interest in building guitars than he did violins, violin cases, anything like that, furniture. So he arranged for his son to apprentice under Johann Stauffer in Vienna, Austria. And Stauffer was pretty much the best known guitar builder in Europe at that time. So when Christian was around 15, he left Markneukirchen, went to Vienna. He studied under Stauffer. He met Ottilie Kuhl. He figured he liked her more than he liked working for Stauffer. So he went to work for her father, Karl Kuhl, who was a harp maker. So Ottilie and Christian ended up getting married. They had their first child, C.F. Martin Jr., and after that, they moved back to Markneukirchen with the dream of building their home and their shop there. But there was a guild system in Markneukirchen. And at this point, the violin makers saw the potential in the guitar. And they didn't want the cabinet makers building guitars. They thought they had the sole right to build any stringed instrument. So they kept taking the cabinet makers to court. And each time the court sided with the cabinet makers because the guitars Christian was building were the best they had ever seen. So this goes on for a number of years. And you know what? Christian decides, I've had enough of this. I want more opportunity. I want more freedom. So in September of 1833, his family and him board a ship in Bremen, Germany. And they arrive on November 6th, 1833. And very early on, we can see that he was working. He was building guitars. He had brought materials with him from Germany. He brought supplies, tools. So he had his shop up and running. And one of the things that we have on display here is the oldest Martin guitar known to exist.
Wow.
So this is it. It's from around May of 1834. And if you look at it, it's very different from what we build now, but this is how C.F. Martin Sr. learned to build guitars in Vienna. It has this clock key adjustment in the neck that Stauffer patented, the tuning machine Stauffer patented. This is a maple neck that's stained black with strips of ivory inlaid in it. Heavy violin influence with the maple back and sides. And if you can zoom in here, take a look at that. Any Martin guitar ever built is going to have a stamp like that, whether it's C.F. Martin, New York, C.F. Martin and Company, New York, or C.F. Martin and Company, Nazareth, Pennsylvania. So there's guitars out there that might look like this, but if they don't have that stamp, they weren't built by Martin.
And the stamp's not always on the headstock?
No. When Martin used this Stauffer style headstock, he would put the stamp on the back of the body, or if the guitar had a square headstock and still had an ice cream cone heel, a lot of times he would do that, or he would put it on the back of the headstock. Also, eventually, you would find the stamp on the inside of the body. Very early on, Martin used paper labels. I don't know if you can get a shot of that. It has the 196 Hudson Street address.
Wow.
And that's how we can really date these early Martins, is based off of the label. I mean, he went through several designs in the first few years of being in the United States. So we can pretty much narrow down based off of the interior label when the guitars were built.
No two-way truss rod on that, I assume?
No, but I mean, this clock key, if you look at it, the fingerboard floats over the top.
Wow.
So you can raise and lower the entire height of the neck, so it's kind of like your precursor, I guess, to the truss rod. It wouldn't take relief out or add relief in, but you could raise the neck up, if the action was getting a little too high, but didn't have to worry about that too much on these old gut string models because they didn't have that steel string tension on them.
Sure.
Now, the Martin family never really felt at home in New York City. Where they were from in Germany was very rural, and they had actually thought about moving back to Germany. But luckily for us, they decided to visit the area. Well, actually, Christian's wife, Ottilie, visited the Nazareth area in 1835, and she wrote a letter home to her husband and said, this place is great. There's a large German-speaking population. It's rolling countryside. It reminds me of Germany. We need to move here. Huh. It took a few years for them to actually do it, but in 1839, the Martin family moved from New York City to Cherry Hill, Pennsylvania, which is really right around the corner from where our Sycamore Street factory is in Nazareth. And this was a really creative period for Martin, because one of the things that happened when they made the move was that in New York City, he was running a retail shop, repairing instruments, trying to build new instruments. But when the family moved to Pennsylvania, C.F. Martin Sr. could concentrate just on building instruments, building guitars. And what we know about him was that he was really a perfectionist when it came to building guitars. If he didn't like something, he wouldn't use it. And in the late 1830s, early 1840s, we start to see him experiment with different bracing patterns. The early Viennese style guitars that he built, those were ladder braced. But he saw the popularity of Spanish guitars and he started emulating those designs, but typically a Spanish guitar would be fan braced. And one of the issues Martin had with fan bracing, if you look at a lot of these early guitars in our museum, is that they use pin bridges. And pin bridges and fan bracing really don't cooperate that well. One of the issues was when he would drill a hole for the bridge pin, sometimes he would hit a brace.
Huh.
And if he would need to repair that, that was a very labor-intensive process of pulling the top off, removing the binding, all of that. So we see him experimenting with these variations. Then in the summer of 1843, the family gets a visit from Madame de Goni, who was pretty much the most popular concert guitarist on the East Coast of the United States at that time. She was from Spain, came over to the US. I'm sure Martin had been acquainted with her through his contacts in New York City. And in 1843, she came to visit. But being a Spanish guitar player, she would only play Spanish-built guitars, which obviously Martin, being a guitar builder, must not have liked that, because according to the story of his granddaughter, one night he snuck away with her guitar and then built this guitar with the same dimensions. Now, the key difference and what is so important about this guitar is this is the earliest known guitar to have an X-brace top. So anybody that builds a flat top steel string guitar like we do now pretty much uses some form of X bracing. Now this is a custom shop replica of what this top actually looks like, of how it's actually braced. A little bit different than we use now, but that is the earliest form of X bracing.
Wow.
So Martin must have liked it because he started transitioning the majority of his instruments over to X bracing. And I mean, when steel strings came around, the company got involved in those. They realized pretty quickly that X bracing was the way to go, just because, I mean, Martin has always been about premium tone. And with a steel string guitar with X bracing, you have the perfect strength to weight ratio. Because if you brace a guitar too heavily, it's not going to sound good. If you brace it too light, it could implode on itself. But with X bracing, you have that perfect ratio, and then you get that tone that Martin's known for. This really could be thought of as Martin's first signature model, the size 1 Dagoni. Way before we were building guitars for Eric Clapton, we were building them for Madame Dagoni.
And a few years ago, am I right to remember you made an authentic that was based on that?
We did. We built the size 1 Dagoni authentic in our custom shop. And one of the aspects, if you want to zoom in on it, that was so difficult for them to replicate was this guitar actually has a nickel silver nut.
Really?
Yeah. So, I mean, traditionally you would think they would have been using ivory, but for some reason, Martin went with the same material that frets are made of.
Huh.
I don't know how they machined that back in 1843, but they figured out a way to do it.
And that idea died on the vine. I guess that was a once and done?
Yeah, I haven't seen any others. If you look at some of the guitars behind us, they do have, like that earliest Martin, it does have a fret wire saddle, but I mean, nothing with that nickel silver nut. If you look at the saddle right here, see, that's just the same thing pretty much as the fret wire would be.
Wow.
Very similar. So that would be a lot easier for Martin to work with than to actually try to shape that nut. I'm guessing he might have worn out some tools doing that. Some of the changes going on at this time, other than X bracing, was the company was looking to move. I mean, they were in Cherry Hill, you know, outside of Nazareth, and Nazareth was a Moravian-only community. So if you weren't of the Moravian faith, you weren't allowed in town after dark. So you could come in during the day and do business, and then, you know, you would need to be out before dark. And during the winter, the days are a lot shorter, you know, a lot less daylight. So I'm sure that affected business at that time. But in the mid-1850s, the Moravian opened land sales to what they called outsiders that weren't their brethren. And so C.F. Martin Jr., who was heavily involved in the business, you know, says to his father, we need to look into this. So the family bought a block of property at North and Main Street in Nazareth, and they built their homes there and our North Street factory. So they made that move officially in 1859. Then you go to 1867. C.F. Martin Sr. is a little bit older. He knows his son has been involved with the company for a long time. He also had a nephew, C.F. Hartman, that was involved with the company. So he brought them on as partners, creating C.F. Martin and Company. That's what we're still known as today. Now this is what a workbench would have looked like at our North Street factory. This would have been around 1920 or so with the Edison style light bulbs. A lot of the tools in the case here and the case on the wall, we believe C.F. Martin Sr. brought with him from Germany. He came to the United States with these tools because we know that he came with tools and material to build with. He had around 400 sets of wood that he brought with him, as well as all of these hand tools.
Wow, 400 sets.
Yep. Now this really isn't involved in this time period, but I want to show you this because it's really cool. So this is a 1929 018K. This was Les Paul's guitar.
No way.
Yes. So this was his first good guitar. He was around 15 or 16 when he received it. And, he told his mom he was playing guitar. He said he had like a catalog guitar and he needed something better. And so she bought this for him. So if you can zoom in here, you'll see numbers written on the fingerboard.
Get out.
So he would sneak out of his house and go to a jazz club in Waukesha, where he grew up, Waukesha, Wisconsin. And he would write down on a napkin where the guitar player, Sonny Joe Wolverton, was playing at. And he wrote the numbers on the fingerboard of each fret, and that's how he learned to play up the neck.
Wow. So it's Martin's fault.
Yep. So yeah, that's Les Paul's Scotch tape they're holding the back together.
Wow.
Now we did some pretty extensive repairs to this guitar. I know the top was really bulged up. It was missing some binding. Our repair department did a great job on it because when it came in, it was in pretty rough shape. But when you talk about historic musicians, I mean, Les Paul is, definitely at one of those at the top of that list.
Wow. I don't remember that guitar being here.
It's actually on loan to us. We've had it for a couple of years now. So one of the things that I did when it came in, I was like, we'll cover the cost of the repairs if we can display the guitar until you want it back. And
wow.
The owner agreed.
That's great.
Yeah, that one's on loan to us by the Neurotic Guitarist. So he has a YouTube channel and a lot of great content. But you talk about a piece of not only guitar history, but music history, because Les Paul, a lot of people don't realize what a great inventor he was and how he affected the recording industry and just did so much. So to be able to display that, it's really awesome.
Absolutely. You guys heard it here first. If you loan Martin your guitar for the museum, they will cover the cost of the repairs.
I mean, to a certain extent. So C.F. Martin Sr., he passes away in 1873. His son C.F. Martin Jr. takes control of the company. He doesn't really change too much. He does standardize the lineup a little bit. In 1887, he brings in more steam-powered equipment to help modernize the factory. Because if you look back at that point, there were companies out of Chicago, mainly Lion and Healy, that were building 100,000 guitars a year. I mean, that's kind of what we build now.
Wow.
So that's incredible, thinking back to 1880, that many guitars being built. I mean, Martin was nowhere near that, but they wanted to, try to be as efficient as possible. But then in 1888, C.F. Jr. suddenly passes away, and then his son, Frank Henry Martin, who's only 22 at the time, takes control. And Frank wants to push the company beyond guitars. He wants to, start building other instruments, and the first opportunity he saw was the mandolin. So the company gets in the mandolin building in the mid-1890s.
1890s.
Yep. So really 1895. And there were a lot of firsts for the company with the mandolin. They were the first Martin instruments to have fingerboard inlay, to have pick guards, to use steel strings, to have serial numbers, and to be built in what we call shop orders or batches, because before then, everything was pretty much more of like a one-off custom shop. Here, this is, I think my favorite mandolin in our collection. This is a harp mandolin built for the Gaskell Company from Shamokin, Pennsylvania. Huh. And I mean, it just amazes me that, they were using steam-powered equipment, but, they didn't have robots and lasers and kind of the stuff we have now, CNC machines. And for them to build something like this is pretty incredible.
I'll say. That's crazy.
And, we should give Robert Getzel a shout out because Robert and I work a lot in the museum. He builds a lot of these custom fixtures so we can display things like this.
Yo, Robert.
Yeah, it gives it a, in addition to all the great artwork he does for the company, he also, does a lot of work in the museum.
Good people.
But if you look at these mandolins, some of them are, really ornate with the top inlay, the fingerboard inlay. Martin never really went that deep with guitars. I mean, there are some, that borrowed that pickguard style, but that top inlay on this style 7 is really wide.
Not a lot of wood left after you put that much pearl, right?
No.
Wow.
If you get the photo over here, these are Frank's sons. This is C.F. Martin III and Herbert Keller Martin, who was a mandolin player, and C.F. III was a guitar player.
So that's Chris's dad on the left.
No, Herbert Keller was C.F. Martin III's brother.
But Chris Martin the second, right? No.
This is C.F. Martin III.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, these are Frank Henry's.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then he would be Frank Herbert's father, who's Chris's dad. So C.F. III is Chris's grandfather.
Gotcha. After I said that out loud on camera, I knew I was way wrong, but I said it anyway.
Now, the next instrument that Frank looked at was the ukulele. The origins of the ukulele go back to the island of Madeira off Portugal. And Madeira's chief crop was wine. So in order to make wine, you need grapes. So they grew grapes, and unfortunately in the 1870s, they had a grape famine. So a lot of men left Madeira looking for work, and they ended up in Hawaii, and they brought with them this little 4-string instrument they called the machete. And very quickly it was adopted by the people of Hawaii. They started calling it the ukulele, the bouncing flea. And when Hawaiian music starts catching on in the mainland, Frank is looking at the ukulele and thinking maybe we should get into building those. But then in 1915, there's the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco that features Hawaiian music. And from there, the Hawaiian music craze is really sweeping the country. And Martin is getting inquiries from their dealers to build ukuleles. So in 1915, the company builds about 15 prototypes. They build a few hundred in 1916 and then go in full-scale ukulele production in 1917. And by the mid-1920s, they were building about 3 times as many ukuleles as guitars. And I mean, the ukulele was one of the reasons why the company was able to survive the Great Depression, because all of the sales they had gotten from ukuleles.
3 times as many ukes as guitars.
Yeah. Now in here, we might have the most historically significant instrument in our collection, which is the Konter ukulele. So there's a photo of Richard Konter. He was in the United States Navy, and he was also a pretty well-known ukulele composer from Brooklyn, New York. And he volunteered to go with Admiral Byrd on the first expedition to the North Pole. And while they're on the ship heading up that way, Konter became friends with Floyd Bennett, who was Byrd's pilot. And he said to Bennett, I want a souvenir from this trip. Can you smuggle my ukulele on the plane?
Smuggle.
So they had a weight limit, but Bennett looked at it, saw the ukulele weighed like a pound, and was like, sure. So he stuffed it under the seat of, under his seat, and him and Byrd make the flight. And then when they land, Bennett gives the ukulele back to Konter. So Konter had the crew of the ship sign it. They had a reception for them in Washington, D.C., and that photos of him in front of the White House. At the reception, he had the president at the time, Calvin Coolidge, signed it, Thomas Edison signed it, Amelia Earhart signed it. So there's about 140 or so signatures on this.
Huh.
Now, a few years ago, we were building this custom shop replica where all of the signatures were laser engraved into the koa. So if you look here, you can see Calvin Coolidge. Then on the side, there's Thomas Edison. Mm-hmm. And then on the bottom, very small, is Amelia Earhart.
Wow.
Then he also documented his travels. He went on that Arctic expedition, and then he went on the first Antarctic expedition. Took the ukulele with him on both trips. In 1953, he sent the ukulele and a letter to Martin Guitar explaining where it was, what all the signatures were about, and traded the ukulele for a D28.
Wow.
So I think, we both worked out pretty well with that trade because, he got a D28 and we got this iconic ukulele to display in our museum.
And it's not fair to say D28s are exactly that rare.
No. But at least, back then it would have been Brazilian rosewood, so it makes it a little more valuable.
Fair enough.
Something else that was influenced by Hawaiian music was the way guitars were played. Hawaiian music featured guitars strung with steel strings, and the guitarist would usually play the guitar flat on their lap with a steel bar. And this can be traced back to Honolulu in the 1880s and two childhood friends, Joseph Kikuku and Makia Kealakai. So they were the first ones that strung a guitar with steel strings, and they started playing it with a railroad tie. And they created this whole new style of playing.
Railroad tie.
A railroad tie,
I thought I heard you say that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And when Hawaiian music is, extremely popular in the late 19 teens and into the 20s, they're touring the vaudeville circuit, and they're influencing guitarists all over the country. And you can hear those Hawaiian influences in early blues music and country music. That's where the origins of the pedal steel guitar come from. It's the Hawaiian steel guitar.
Wow. Would you mind if we record the second part of this episode in Hawaii?
I'd be down for that. Yeah, sure. Now, this little unassuming guitar here, this is a 217. And what's so important about this guitar is that it was Martin's first model that they only offered with steel strings. So it was released in 1922, and at that time you could get a guitar strung with steel for Spanish playing, how this is set up, with steel for Hawaiian playing with the strings raised up, or with gut for Spanish playing. But when Martin was deciding on this model, they wanted to keep it only steel strings because, one, it would help them bring the cost down, because the string regulation, they called it, or what we call it now, the action would vary. So they knew if they just did this with steel strings, they would only have to set it up one way. And this was also the company's first guitar to have a mahogany top.
Oh.
So they had been using mahogany back and sides since the 1800s, but they started using mahogany tops on the 17s.
And this is 1922?
1922. So when the Great Depression hits, in 1929, they dropped the price on this guitar to $25, and it was about half of their guitar sales in 29 and 30 were this guitar.
Yo.
Now, we're going to take a look at something interesting here. I don't know if you have a lot of baseball fans that listen to the podcast, but
Sure.
even if they're not, this is pretty cool. This is a 1926 0018 that is signed by Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig.
Wow.
Yep, two legendary Hall of Fame baseball players. And I know you can find baseballs and baseball bats out there that they both signed, but I'm pretty sure this is the only guitar. So what all the signatures represent, these were all supporters of Al Smith, who was running against Herbert Hoover to be president in 1928. So I guess they would travel around with the guitar and have his supporters sign it. And if you can zoom in here, we'll get the lighting as good as possible. Right here we have Babe Ruth's signature. And right here we have Lou Gehrig's.
Just that part of the guitar is so valuable.
Yeah.
Wow.
And there's a photo of Babe Ruth holding it. We also have photos in our archives of both of them signing the guitar.
Awesome.
If you hear any unusual noises in the background, they're renovating upstairs. So.
That's not an elephant?
No.
I was going to ask you.
No. I mean, we do support Save the Elephants, but we don't house any of them here.
Yet.
That'd be interesting. Come view the museum, take a factory tour, and an elephant ride.
I was going to leave early, but I'm staying now.
Yeah. So when we get into the late 1920s, and then especially into 1930, this is what we call the golden era of Martin guitar. And the reason for that is Martin builds the OM-28, which is considered the first modern acoustic guitar. And the origins of that OM model start in 1929 with a banjo player from Georgia named Perry Bechtel. So he's trying to make a transition from the banjo to the guitar. He finds archtop guitars that he likes, but he can't find any flat tops because all of the flat top guitars, they were all the 12 fret neck to body joint, so the body was longer, the neck was shorter and wider, and if you've ever played a banjo before, you know they have long skinny necks. So he contacted Martin and said, can you build me a guitar with a longer neck? And they're like, yeah, we think we can do it. So they took their triple O and squared off the shoulders, and they borrowed the profile from an archtop guitar, and they created this OM-28, the orchestra model. So it had a longer, slimmer neck, 14 frets, and Martin realized pretty quickly that this was the way to go. So they started changing all of their designs over to the 14 fret neck. I mean, they still offered 12 fret necks, but eventually later on in the 1930s, they would just be available on special order only.
And this is 1930, did you say?
That was 1929.
29.
Now in 1930, Martin built what might be the rarest guitar in our collection, the OM-45 Deluxe. Only 11 of these were built. They were, I think, $240 that year. So, I mean, that was the height of the Great Depression, so this was a very pricey guitar. But this had all the elements that a guitar player would want in their OM. Adirondack spruce top and Brazilian rosewood back and sides and all of the beautiful pearl inlay. And then you added that pearl pickguard to make it and the pearl inlay on the bridge wings to make it the deluxe model. Now, a lot of people are familiar with this guitar because Roy Rogers. So when he still went by Leonard Sly, he bought one of these in a pawn shop in Los Angeles. Must have, got a good deal on it, but a lot of people consider this the Roy Rogers model because he ended up playing it throughout his career. Not this specific guitar, but a guitar like it.
I'm going to look into the future and see some YouTube comments. What's that guitar's approximate value, Jason? On the spot.
Around $300,000.
God.
Yep. And I mean, it's, excuse me, when you look at the guitars in this case here, and we talk about the earliest Martins, a lot of people are surprised at how much more these guitars are worth. I mean, the early Martins, they're cool, but they're not really what modern guitar players want. So like if you were lucky enough to have enough money to buy a guitar like this, you could play it like it's an OM-42 Deluxe. And
that's a good point, yeah.
And speaking of that, for the Deluxe series, the modern Deluxes, we borrowed the neck profile off of this guitar for those.
That's right. That's Spoon Phillips' favorite neck, and yeah. I hear that maybe 5 or 6 times a week from him.
Yeah. Spoon's he's a smart man, so.
Your words. Really sorry he couldn't be here today, by the way. This is a field trip for me, and Spoon, we miss you.
Right here, this is probably my favorite instrument in our collection. It's a 1933 OM-45 that was owned by John DeGroat. So John was in the United States Army, and he served in World War II, and he drove a radio dispatch truck, and he took this guitar all over Europe during the war. So this beautiful pearl inlaid Martin survived World War II.
Wow.
mean, still in, really great shape.
You can leave that open.
Okay.
I mean, all day.
Yeah. What Martin is probably best known for is the dreadnought. Now, when a lot of people think of an acoustic guitar, the Martin dreadnought is what comes to mind, like a D18 or a D28. This happens to be a Ditson 111, which is what the first dreadnoughts look like. And the story behind the dreadnought was, I had mentioned his name before, the performer from Hawaii, Makia Kealakai. So in 1916, Martin built a special guitar for him that was larger than their Triple O. And Martin was building special instruments for their largest customer at the time, the Ditson Company. And when they saw the drawings for the Kealakai guitar, they wanted something similar, but in their wide-waisted shape, which is what this dreadnought turned out to be. It was that special Ditson shape. And because it was so different than anything Martin was building at the time, they weren't quite sure what to call it, because everything before then went by a number system, like a size 1 or a size 2 or single O, double O, triple O, so forth. So that was World War I era, and the largest warships at the time were the HMS Dreadnoughts from the British Navy, so Martin decided to borrow the name of the warship for the guitar. So to dreadnought, you don't fear anything when you're on that ship, and when you're on stage, you don't fear, the banjos or mandolins being too loud. Everybody's gonna hear you playing your dreadnought. Martin built the dreadnought just for Ditson until Ditson went out of business in 1930. And then they decided to start building it under their own name. Originally, they built the D1 and the D2, but a little later on, they're like, you know what, this is pretty much a style 18 and a style 28, so we're gonna call them a D18 and a D28. And this happens to be the first D28 ever built.
The first.
The first. This was once owned by the actor Richard Gere. He had a really large instrument collection, and we happened to acquire this at a Christie's auction.
Wow.
The initial dreadnought sales, they were pretty slow. It wasn't until 1934 when Martin changed the design and went with the OM model design, the 14 fret neck to body, and that's when dreadnought sales really took off and became extremely popular with early country and bluegrass musicians.
You could say that's still true to this day, or the 14 fret is more popular than 12?
Yeah, that's, the majority of guitarists prefer 14 fret necks. I know, 12 fret necks have kind of had the revivals, like, the folk era, late 50s into the 60s, and there's a certain set of musicians that really do like them, but I think the vast majority like the longer, slimmer neck on a dreadnought, or pretty much any guitar in general. We do build some 12 fret models, but the majority of what we build are 14 frets. And 13 frets with the SC. Can't forget that.
That's a lot later in the story.
Yep. Now, we can't talk about pre-war dreadnoughts without talking about the D-45. The holy grail of acoustic guitars.
Okay.
This is number 80 out of the 91 that were built before Martin stopped production because of World War II. Pretty much all original, except somebody did put a strap button on the heel. I guess they were playing gigs, and yeah.
Blasphemer.
Yeah. But all of the great style 45 appointments you would expect with the pearl inlay and Brazilian rosewood. This one happens to still be Adirondack spruce on the top. whenever you see one of these come up for sale, they're usually several $100,000, just because it doesn't have to be owned by anybody special. It's just, these are extremely special guitars just, by themselves.
Just so limited.
Yeah. And I mean, the 14 fret dreadnought, I mean, a lot of people consider it the perfect tool for pretty much any type of music. I mean, originally, yeah, country, bluegrass, but then, folk, rock and roll, so on and so on. And so many iconic musicians have played Martin dreadnoughts through the years. It just, works so well with whatever you're playing. So all of these innovations, the OM and the dreadnought, those were done under Frank Henry Martin. And, in the mid-1940s, he was in his 80s, and, he decided, it's time for him to step aside. So his son, C.F. Martin III, becomes president of the company. He's in charge. And, he doesn't change too much. He kind of shrinks down their lineup at that time because, they got rid of all the pearl bordered instruments because of wartime restrictions and things like that. But, I mean, it's really the Martin Guitar Standard series is what really sticks out because, I mean, that was the core of what was being built in the 1940s. And you see all of the musicians from the 40s and then into the 50s that were playing Martin. And it wasn't like Martin was giving them instruments or cutting them a deal. They were buying them the way pretty much anybody else would buy a Martin. They chose to play a Martin because, they had the best sound to them. So if we look in this exhibit, this is, pretty much 1946 to 1963. You can see, one of the Hank Williams senior prototypes for the Signature Series model, and then Bill Monroe with the D28, and Elizabeth Cotton, the Kingston Trio, who in the late 1950s were pretty much the most popular group in the country. And then, you get on into the early 60s, and Muddy Waters is playing one of Martin's 018Es on his Folk Singer album. So it just kind of goes to show that a lot of the people that laid the groundwork for popular music today were playing Martin instruments.
No doubt.
Now this is another interesting guitar in our collection. So this was owned by Fred Clay, who was in a country band in Southern California. And he happened to be friends with Leo Fender. So one day, he went into Leo's shop, and at that time, Leo Fender was building amps, PAs, and he just got started in building lap steel guitars. And he said to Leo, "You know what? I'm having trouble being heard. Can you help me out?" So what Leo did was he hooked up one of his lap steel pickups to this 00018, put some control knobs in it. I mean, hopefully for Fred it worked out because, it just doesn't look that pretty, and that pickup probably added a lot of weight to the top. But we do know this is Leo Fender's first experiment at electrifying a fretted instrument.
Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Wow.
So far, we also have Les Paul and Leo Fender somehow involved with Martin.
Wow. If the tour stopped here, it's quite impressive, and it doesn't stop here.
No, we still have a little ways to go yet.
Wow. So time-wise, we're into the 50s and 60s?
Yeah, here, yep, we're late 40s, 50s, early 60s in here. And in 1955, Frank Herbert Martin joins the company. So that's Chris's dad. And he was younger, he was 22 at the time, and he was really in tune to what was going on. So, a lot of the popularity, the connection with the popular musicians at that time, could be attributed to him. And he saw how these musicians were using Martin instruments, and, sales just kept growing and growing. They were still in North Street factory, and if you would have went into a Martin dealer in the late 1950s and ordered a D28, they would have told you to come back in 2 to 3 years.
Oh, wow.
That's how back ordered they were. So they knew they needed to do something different, and he urged his dad to look into building a modern state-of-the-art factory. So in late 1963, the company breaks ground for the factory we're in now, the Sycamore Street factory. So in Sycamore Street, everything was on one floor, a lot more modern, and you can see the production totals from when the factory opened in July 1964 on. You can just see the production totals keep going up and up. Now, during this time, the mid-60s into the late 60s, you have singer-songwriter movement. You have so much going on in music. And a lot of the artists at that time were playing Martin instruments. I mean, here we have a 1969 D-45. So Martin re-released the D-45 in 1968, and when they did that, all the members of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young bought one. Jimi Hendrix bought one. I mean, there was that clamoring for that pearl inlay, and Martin brought it back. They brought in Mike Longworth from Tennessee to oversee the inlay. Here we have a D-1235 that belonged to Judy Collins. So Judy Collins and Tom Paxton played the opening ceremonies when the Sycamore Street factory was first opened. They had an open house in 1964, and they played on the one loading dock here.
Wow.
This is another of my favorites in the museum. This is a 1880 single 040 that was owned by Joan Baez. So this still has her set list taped to the side of it. And I mean, I love the neck on this guitar. I just, it's just a great guitar. And the sound, I mean, this guitar was built for gut strings really, but it is X-brace, so you can put extra light steel strings on it. So it's just, an amazing tone, and just the fact that Joan owned it for a few years in the 60s and her set list is still on there.
Wow. That was a great exhibit you guys had for a while.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was, a great experience working with her and being able to display all of her artwork.
I know Robert was really proud of that too.
Yeah. Now, one of the big changes that came about in the 1960s was Martin had to move on from using Brazilian rosewood. So in 1965, Brazil placed an embargo on the export of rosewood from their country. So Martin couldn't get it in the size and the quantity that they needed, and so they were trying to figure out what to do. Well, they came up with the idea to use the smaller pieces of rosewood they had on hand, build a guitar with a 3-piece back. And that's where the D-35 comes from. This is one of the prototypes. There were 4 different prototypes, and they were all braced differently. And this happened to be the prototype that features the bracing we use with the 1/4-inch top bracing. So it's, a D-35 is braced lighter than a D-28 or a D-18. Those have 5/16.
Do you remember some of the other bracing combinations?
They were 1/4-inch. So the back on the D-35 is 5/16. There were, I think they were 1/4-inch top and back, 5/16 top and back, and I forget there was one more variation.
Interesting. This one here in the museum, that's the traditional style? What the current style?
Yes, yeah. That's the style that was chosen when Martin started building the addition.
See, I'm listening. Sometimes.
So we have so much great stuff to look at in our museum that, we're going to have to do this in another episode. But I wanted to thank Martins and More podcast for being here, and for everybody that's going to tune in and listen. And please remember, you can come visit our museum. We're open Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. and we do factory tours 10 a.m. to 2 p.m.